Welcome to a special Healthcare du Jour event. Today, we dish up and digest how the November elections will impact healthcare and healthcare reform. For the next 60 minutes, sit back as we bring you insight, commentary, and discussion on today's topic, all expertly served up by our host and his guests. Healthcare du Jour is sponsored by the law offices of Myrick O'Connell. And now here is our host, Matt Fisher.
Welcome back, and thank you for joining as we dive into the hottest topics in healthcare. I'm your host, Matt Fisher. On the menu today is an election special with Dan Monroe, Justin Barnes, and Devin Jopp. Before we dive into what is sure to be a very active discussion, I think I'd like to have each of you just give a little introduction to everyone who's listening. So since the way I'm looking at it, Dan, you're on top. Do you want to go first?
Sure, absolutely. Dan Monroe here, writer, speaker, and now author on the topic of healthcare, which I've been writing about for almost 5 years now as a Forbes contributor, and then just released this year my first book called Casino Healthcare.
Yes, no, I've been tracking that, so it's still on my to-do for a reading list, but it's definitely on there. And I've seen some excerpts, and it looks great. So, Devin, would you like to introduce yourself next?
Yeah, sure. Nice to meet everybody. My name is Devin Jopp. I'm the CEO of Future Focus Leadership and Future Focus Health. We do strategic advising services for different nonprofit organizations. Been in the industry for probably about 20 years in various different capacities before starting my own firm. And I too have a book coming out on corporate board intelligence. So look for a theater near you soon.
Yeah, no, thanks for joining. It's great to meet you as well. And Justin, how about you?
Sure, Justin Barnes. I'm a Chief Growth Officer for iHealth Innovations, and then also just an industry strategist and public policy guy or expert, and just spend a lot of time navigating care providers to the future of healthcare. I do have a radio show on one of the sister networks here on Healthcare Now Radio called This Just In, and we talk about a lot of public policy and healthcare strategy and just overall how to navigate the future of healthcare successfully. Look forward to today's conversation.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's great to meet you too, Justin. It's nice to follow in someone else's footsteps because I know you've had a very successful program. But diving in, as we said, we're going to focus on the election and the impact on healthcare today. So I think let's go with the big question first, which is to the extent that any of us can, use our crystal balls to figure out what impact would happen if, we'll pick Clinton first, I guess. So if Clinton wins, what would be the impact on healthcare? Dan, do you want to lead us off?
Sure. I'm probably going to be the pessimist of the group, in part because I think we have larger issues in our government that are going to come front and center, not only as a part of this election cycle, but then for the next 4 years, and I think that will play out in healthcare to the extent that it does in a way that means that we won't make any real progress, unfortunately. The two issues that Clinton will try hard to champion will be probably drug pricing reform, whereby Medicare attempts to try and negotiate pricing for prescription drugs. That's a known issue, and then the other one is the possibility of promoting a public option for coverage, for health insurance coverage. The challenge is getting either of those through a divided Congress. So the top of the ticket is, I think, less influential ultimately through this election cycle and the next 4 years than what will happen in Congress.
Justin, you want to hop in next?
Sure. So I don't disagree with Dan per se. I mean, if Clinton were to be elected, I certainly do see, the focus on prescription drug, reduction in the cost. I do see expansion of ACA and expansion of the transition to value-based care. And I do see, working on trying to reduce the cost of co-pays. Now, those all sound great. And almost everybody can get behind all that, but who's going to pay for it? I think at the end of the day, where those costs going to lie? How do you actually get that through, as Dan brought up? How do you get that through Congress? It's a very fiscally focused Congress. We're not quite sure how much more debt we can throw onto the American, public. And so, how do we actually make that happen? It's in policy. It's easy to create these thoughts and ideas, But, as a business owner and as someone who's employed, tens of thousands of people, at the end of the day, we've got to make things happen and actually drive a profitable bottom line and really drive the country forward. And so I think that's where the rubber meets the road, and that'll certainly, be a telling sign. But I think Dan's spot on, and I agree. We're going to see a lot of the issues today just move forward.
Yeah, and I think to build on that, what Justin and Matt Justin and Dan talked about really is around this concept of, it's going to be, if Clinton comes in, it's a continuation of policy from the Obama administration. To add on, and I think ditto everything was just said, but one of the things I would add is I do think the exchanges are going to have to be dealt with. You're seeing these large insurers. We just saw it again happen. With Aetna now dropping out, that's going to create big problems for being able to actually handle the financing side of this. So to that extent, I really think you're going to see Clinton having to come in and possibly do some horse trading with a split Congress, which is going to be tough, right? Because there's some negotiations she's going to have to give up in order to get Congress to even go along with some patches to try to address some of these things.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very fair point that all of you made, which is, the president only has so much ability to influence things, especially if there's a Congress at odds. But that being said, kind of maybe flipping to the other side, what in terms of what would happen if Trump wins, he certainly seems to be a shoot from the hip, at least in terms of comments. It's extremely unclear in terms of what could actually happen from a policy perspective, or arguably his actual grasp on what is permissible under the law and the Constitution. But leaving those pieces of it aside, do you think that because if Trump came in, it seems like it wouldn't be the continuation of the Obama administration, but it would be a completely different tact on things. Do you guys think that would have a different impact?
Who do you want? I can start. I'll start with the conversation. I'll take it. So, you look through Trump's platform, and I stay fiercely bipartisan because I like to get things done. But I think he puts out there that he may try to repeal ACA. I don't see that as realistic. I think that ACA is signed, sealed, and delivered. I totally agree with whoever gets in there would have to look at the exchanges. I completely agree with that. That's got to be something. And a single-payer system is not a solution, and it's at least my opinion. I don't think the American public was moving down that path too quickly. So I think you do have to actually deal with them instead of just offering a single-payer solution. But then also, when you look at some of the other campaign items from Trump regarding health care, he was looking at health care insurance across state lines. And I know we'll probably talk about that later on. And I believe in competition breeds excellence. So personally, I think that could be something decent. But then also there's other tax benefits around paying for health care and deducting health insurance premiums if that's part of the Trump plan. I don't see his health care plan. I do agree with you with his statements, but I don't see his health care plan specifically being counter to any major Republican strategies, at least that I have seen. Again, I agree with your comment, but I don't see his policies being significantly different than a lot of the Republican agenda, at least from what I have seen. So I'd probably say that much regarding the Trump campaign.
So, Devin, you want to jump in?
Yeah, so, I think Justin kind of hit on it. Everything that I'm seeing is really very much a Republican traditional stance on terms of free enterprise and trying to allow the free market through allowing payers to compete with each other. Although that, too, I think could still lead to having larger plans. These acquisitions, I don't think that's over yet, and I think that's going to continue whether it's Clinton or whether it's Trump. It's just going to depend on the mechanism by which that's triggered. I think Trump, while he seems to be verbose and oftentimes unpredictable, the real reality is I go back to the same comment we just talked about, which is he's going to have to deal with a House and Senate that's divided. And even if he wanted to repeal it, he's got to get it through the Senate and the House together. That's going to be a tough road. Not impossible, but tough for a number of different reasons, not even depending on who's carrying it, but who's going to just sit there and filibuster it to death, too. So it'll be interesting to see what he gets in and what he can do through executive action versus through legislation, possibly.
And Dan?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I'd add a personal note, which is just a totally personal opinion, but from what I've seen so far, Trump is really running for a position that doesn't exist. which is king of USA. And I think there's a lot of sort of reality gaps between understanding how politics works in this country relative to Congress. And I think you alluded to it and then sort of backed off maybe, but I think it's a very real proposition that he would try to exert influence in a way that could trigger impeachment quickly. And I think Congress would be more than happy to serve that up and deliver it quickly in the event that he attempted that. So relative to health care, though, he hasn't really said or done much other than say Obamacare is terrible and awful and he would repeal it. And the fact is, I don't think his popularity within his base has any real health care impact or real focus in the sense of making changes or tweaks to the reform that we've seen so far. So his popularity isn't to a base that is concerned about healthcare issues. His popularity transcends that, and so I don't think it's a real issue for the kind of popularity that he's gotten so far.
And actually, that comment is a great way to come around to a different question I had, which is, it feels like, at least on the presidential level, and I think this is kind of a good place to expand it into congressional and maybe even state gubernatorial elections, but at least on the presidential level, it feels like healthcare, after having been the primary subject for feels like the past 8 years, is now feels like it's on the sidelines. Again, on the presidential level, I guess, do you guys agree with that? And then do you see it? Do you think it's going to be more of an issue on the kind of the sub tickets?
Yeah, maybe I'll kick off this one. I think what you're putting your finger on is absolutely right, Matt. The real reality of it is we're seeing greater things out there kicking healthcare to the sidelines, and I think the appetite for another huge bill on healthcare would almost seem a little tone deaf to what's going on in the country. We have issues with terrorism, all of the issues around immigration reform and homeland security, and that's even before you get to a host of other things out there on trying to deal with taxes and so on and so forth. So I think you're going to, and I think Dan maybe led off with it initially, you're going to see a dampening effect on healthcare. Now, to the extent that some of these things won't get chipped around the edges, I think that's certainly true. I think if Clinton wins, certainly, she'll continue some of the regulatory movement forward that's already been allowed by Congress. But I think that's a very real and enduring legacy we're probably going to face over the next 4 years. Is unless something changes and the world becomes safer and we don't have as much to worry about, healthcare is probably going to be a little bit more of a B-level issue, I'm afraid.
So, Dan, do you have any thoughts to add since I kind of bounced off or jumped off of the comments we were making?
Yeah, I think we're struggling with healthcare in the sense of cost, and that was one of the things that never really was addressed with the Affordable Care Act. We're trying to do experiments in the sense of moving from a fee-for-service model to what's called value-based, but there's a lot of questions about how you shuffle that risk. And simply transferring risk to providers is a real challenge. And we're the first country to really attempt any kind of experiment around moving off of fee for value or fee for service. And there's large questions around whether or not that will work at scale. First of all, the savings that we're seeing are nominal. And secondly, the risk, shifting the risk around is still a big issue.
And Justin?
Yeah, and I probably don't disagree. I'm probably a little bit more bullish, or I am bullish today. I'm pretty knee-deep in a lot of practices and hospitals across the country. And while Dan's right that the risk is shifted to providers, it's also shifted heavily to patients. And and I call them consumers now. And they're with high-deductible health plans, they're picking up much more of the cost than ever before. And it's sizable. It's not just a small sliver. It's not $100 here and $100 there, but it's thousands here and thousands there. And that shift is happening, and certainly everybody's paying more for healthcare. Doctors are, doctors go at more at risk. Patients are such much more at risk, and certainly the payers are getting more at risk in certain scenarios. And so this risk is being spread around. I guess I see a lot of emotions that are occurring today on the regulatory side as continuing, and I see them continuing no matter who's president. So under Trump or under Clinton, I think this ship has sailed, and I don't think there's any turning back. I don't see any, I guess, again, I'm very bullish, so I guess there's people who are tackling it today, and they're doing okay, and regarded, and I do agree that there's certainly only now certain savings happening in certain places, but I also see where there are larger savings. I do see where people are just getting, smarter in a lot of components of their business. They're truly running their practice in their hospital like a business, more than just a la carte and just servicing and just kind of doing the fee-for-service model, but they're really looking at the bottom line much, and they should be doing this for the last 20, 30, 40 years, but with Medicare and with all these payment systems that we employed and deployed, it didn't really move in that direction well enough. So I see a lot of that positivity today where we're shifting that focus and onto the bottom line, and it works. And again, it's only going to work for the people that really engage it. So I am bullish. I have a very positive outlook on where we're going. Again, because I'm knee deep in it in a lot of ways, and but I don't see a lot of big sea changes no matter who is out there. I don't see a lot of big sea changes, and I'm sure we'll talk about this in a moment, if Congress changes. So, I look forward to the discussion.
Yeah, I think you're right that, because it's been kind of a consistent comment all along, right, of what we've been saying, which is, the president's only going to have so much ability because Congress isn't going to be able to, pessimistically get its act together to pass any real legislation that's going to change anything. So if that's the case, and we're dealing with the regulators who are going to be trying to implement existing laws that, we'll assume are not going to change, what impact could there be on that if you have a really radical change in the leadership of the particular agencies? Because I could see that as being an avenue to really have an impact that might actually be a realistic one as well. So Justin, maybe you want to lead that one off since it's kind of touching on your bullish attitude.
Yeah, so I guess if you look out over macro, that's the hot legislation today, where MIPS and advanced APMs are going to come from. That was a fiercely bipartisan bill. That passed with overwhelming support in Congress. Republicans and Democrats all voted for it, and that's the driving mechanism today. So again, I don't see either. And I work with Republicans on the Hill today. I work with Democrats on the Hill today. I work with both campaigns. No one is saying that bill needs to go away, or we're drafting a significant sea change that will get any legs whatsoever from a majority of either party to change macro. And that's one of the biggest pieces. Now, you talk about, and I don't want to bring up the ACA because, that was passed by a Democratic Congress. We have a Republican Congress today, and you're not going to get the supermajority to repeal ACA. We moved on from that. So macro is the big piece today. I don't see any changes. You can change out the head of CMS or the head of HHS or even the head of ONC. I just don't see any big changes, and so that's kind of why I'm bullish. I think we see the roadmap. There could be tweaks. There will always be tweaks. And nothing are perfect. That's kind of why I'm bullish. I think we see the map, and we're slowly marching towards it.
So how about you, Dan? Because I feel like this kind of goes in line with a lot of the commentary I've seen from you in healthcare.
Yeah, so in fairness, I'm definitely more bearish, in part because we still haven't addressed the 800-pound elephant in the room, and that's cost. And these legislative sort of monstrosities that come through with 900 pages here and thousands of pages here that try to shift risk and that try to accommodate business interests around revenue and profits for healthcare don't wind up saving a lot of money, and that's the experiments that we've seen so far. They do have some incremental savings, and those are important to realize, but they don't change the picture overall relative to what it costs for an American family of four. And I keep coming back to the Milliman Medical Index because it's a good one relative to the timeline that it tracks going all the way back to 2002. And the Milliman Medical Index is the one used by the actuarial firm Milliman, tracking the annual healthcare costs for a family of 4 with PPO coverage through an employer. And this year it's almost $26,000. And that number has been going up every year since 2002, and I don't think it'll change in the next 4 years on the path that we're currently going.
Yeah, and it's nice. I'll add maybe the middle variety, right? So you got one on one side, one on the other. I think it's going to depend again on who gets elected and how the House and the Senate are made. I'm going to go on party lines. I think Justin will be correct if you see the Democrats by and large take the presidency or maintain in the House of the Senate, take one of the House of the Senate. It'll be a relative consistent. If Trump comes in, I think you're going to be more likely to see more opportunities to try to at least gut something. I don't know if it's a wholesale repeal, because I'm not sure you can do that easily without getting a host of other things in line. But to me, it just strikes that this issue about cost, and I really do agree with Dan. That's a big issue. It's not like as the premiums are going up for families, there is a point in time where that becomes a untenable situation to move forward. And I think that Congress will start feeling that pressure if these continue to escalate. But how fast we get there and whether we try to patch, which would be more of a Clinton approach or a Trump approach to try to really back end some way to do this through a private approach and more of a tax credits kind of model, I think is yet to be written. But that's kind of my middle ground on how I see it.
I'd kind of like to pursue
this. Matt,
oh, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, Matt. Let me pick up. Yeah, so, and I don't disagree with, I'm a fiscal guy, so I totally agree on the cost structure. But also, this isn't Republican-Democrat, because actually, when you look at accountable care, that's a Republican strategy back from the 90s. So that actually, that's why a lot of that was, that one component was very bipartisan. Actually, it was the whole insurance exchange component that was much more contentious politically. But when you look at accountable care, there's not too many people out there, Republican or Democrat, think that's a horrible idea and won't work. Because cost is a significant issue. Dan is right, Devin's right. Cost is a significant problem. And that's why we're trying to look at different ways to begin to reduce that. But again, with macronizing being implemented for the next couple of years, even if it goes into effect, you begin calculating measures in 2017, you're not going to have any effect on cost until 2021, 2023. So I agree with you. Cost is certainly an issue, and I think everybody agrees on that.
Yeah, I would like to continue the cost discussion. Me being from Massachusetts, I think I have a somewhat unique perspective when it comes to the legislative side of things, because obviously we had the universal coverage first, and then we've already followed with that second step, which theoretically is trying to control costs, because they always said first step is get everyone covered with insurance, and then the next step is let's try and change the system so we can control the cost. So do we think that national legislation needs to do the same thing, or are there, I guess, sufficient tools within the ACA to try and pursue some of these cost goals? I think Dan was alluding to that that there's been experiments that are making, at best, incremental savings. So is that, are there enough demonstrations or full projects that can be done, or is more legislation needed? And if more legislation is needed, what's the likelihood of being able to garner bipartisan support for it? Maybe I'll let Dan lead this off, since he's been hammering the cost piece.
Yeah, so, sort of unpacking that is the cost is front and center on the road ahead, and the challenge is that we have a larger issue politically in the sense of having a functioning government. The fact is that money has corrupted the system in such a way that the political landscape is heavily influenced by contributions from outside entities. And I'm not convinced that we're going to make, in fact, healthcare becomes a lens into that kind of conflict of interest, and it's a big one. The pharmaceutical industry is by far one of the largest contributors to campaign financing for Congress, and so is the health insurance industry. And these lobbying efforts play out every 4 years, every 2 years in Congress, and then every 4 years in the presidential cycle. But I don't think we're going to make significant progress on some of these core issues, certainly infrastructure issues like health care, unless and until we address the larger issue of campaign finance reform. That was on the agenda for Bernie, and unfortunately it didn't carry him to be the nominee, but I think it raised the issue and elevated it in a way that suggests we haven't addressed it and it will come back again.
Yeah, your mention of campaign finance reform hits in all the favorite of mine. I actually wrote my college thesis about campaign finance reform, and then obviously McCain-Feingold got somewhat gutted.
Right.
It's always a difficult thing to pursue. But back to the cost questions. I'll let Devin and Justin weigh in too.
Yeah, and I think, when you get back to costs, and it really comes back to two parts of this. And one is there's going to have to be farmers going to have to get dealt with at some point. And that's a really hard lobby to overcome. It's extremely powerful. But I think, particularly if Clinton gets elected, you may see a shift to try to do something on that around the edges. I mean, really letting Medicare come in and help negotiate rates and using some competitive efforts might be a good opportunity to try to drive that down. But it's for years, and I will admittedly say I've come out of the health insurance industry over the years in my own background, so my own bias. But there's always kind of the gun drawn between the pharmaceutical companies and the health insurers that say, well, gee, if it wasn't for this, we keep our costs down. And the other one says, well, gee, we keep our costs down, right? And I think on the insurance side, you also have to deal with the fact that they also are returning great profits right now, right? These companies aren't starving right now. I think some of the smaller health plans might be more hand-to-mouth or community health plans. But some of the large national ones are doing pretty well. And so, in an era where costs is kind of continue to get passed down to the consumer, there's going to have to be some models around this. And I think to really pick up on this concept of cost, insurers really look at a lot of the cost control on how to make the network narrow. And, and so trying to make those networks more and more narrow, and Americans want more and more choice, oftentimes leads to really irreconcilable problems in terms of cost, right? Because we want to be able to keep that network to manage utilization, but on the other hand, we have consumers that want more. And I think those are going to be some of the difficult choices we have to make if we really want to deal seriously with the cost issues.
Yeah, I actually disagree with anything here. I don't know if there's anything to disagree with. I mean, I don't know people that I come across that loves all the money and how it controls a lot of our politics. That's just wrong in a lot of ways. And if there's ways to fix that, then certainly I think a lot of us would be all for it. It skews in both directions in a very bad way, in my opinion. So all for campaign finance reform. Regarding cost specifically, I guess again I'm on the bullish side where I think this is taking time. We're changing how our healthcare system functioned for 40 plus years. So I do believe in the High-Tech Act where we layered on technology. Then we layered on more policy. Because you got to have technology as the foundation for our healthcare system in 2009. Then 2010 we layered on more policies around accountable care. Now we're layering on more of the mechanics of how fee-for-service transition to value-based care. So I think this just all takes time. Nothing big. Certainly when you're talking about a $3 trillion and a $4 trillion system, this all takes time. And so it's just, and we will see as we transition. Again, I'm bullish. I'm out there and working with practices. They want to make a difference. They love, being able to create a more efficient ecosystem within their practice, within their hospital. They love seeing more money to the bottom line. And that's just exciting. So, and I thrive off of that. And so I guess that's probably why I'm bullish.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair point. And I kind of wanted to pick up on what Devin was saying, talking about bringing the insurance perspective, and I think actually all three of you, I think, might have already referred to this but in terms of Trump's proposal of allowing interstate insurance. Obviously, I think we've probably all seen the idea and probably all seen criticism of the idea, but is there a way that it could be tweaked that it would work, and could that concept be a way to start tapping into the cost question?
Yeah, so I'll dive in on that one in part because I've looked at this relative to the payer landscape in general. And while it's a fair assessment to say that the payers are making a profit, it's not that that profit is wildly lucrative. It's that it's very predictable. So if you look at the net profit margin of a large payer, say United Health or Aetna or Cigna, the net profit margin for these companies is typically on the order of 4 to 5%. Now, granted, that's a big number that they're playing off of, but if you look at the pharmaceutical industry by comparison, net profit margin in that industry often exceeds 20%, as do tech companies like Apple. My point to that is simply that insurance is severely compressed, as it is, relative to a net profit margin. So if you're looking to make big changes in costs, taking out net profit margins in small increments won't get you to the kinds of dramatic savings that we need to see in the next 4, 8, and 10 years. And so that's why that's the argument that I make relative to it. The payer landscape is that you can shuffle that deck and you can make it a national, you can sell across state lines, you can compress the insurance industry down to even a single payer. You're not going to see dramatic changes in costs with those kinds of changes.
Yeah, and to follow in on this issue about payer and interstates, I mean, I think the reality of it is we've been down this road a long time ago. I mean, it was really one of the premises of Clinton Care, and back then there were a couple payers that, were lobbying to become the, couple organizations that were going to be the final players. With these latest rounds of mergers, we were kind of seeing a direction of that until kind of the Obama administration kind of grabbed the reins and yanked it back. But I agree. I think what you're just going to see is less competition ultimately, and a lot of the cost on the payer side are probably going to remain a similar factor and a relatively constant factor. One casualty going interstate, I think, is that you really start losing some of the folks in the Blues landscape, on the Blues network. And these are a lot of times plans that have done well dealing with the hardest populations. And if you start moving to national models, you're really going to allow these other nationals to really swallow them up and become, again, a less competitive landscape. So I don't know that a single payer market's really going to improve the price point. I agree with Dan, ultimately down to the patient side of things. I think the consumer's probably still going to pay at the pump, if you will. But what we're going to do, it may end up in paying a little bit more because we actually have gotten rid of a whole landscape of folks that are playing in the space.
Yeah, and I'm not going to disagree with any of that because that's all very true. I mean, I think we need healthy competition here, whatever it may be. I think you can argue both sides of that, but I don't think there's nobody that I come across that truly is objective, looks at a single payer system in their country, says, this is fantastic. They have 2-tiered, 3-tiered systems, and the wealthy do very well. The wealthy always have their own health insurance plans. They all have private doctors. And I don't think that that's the direction that we want to go as a country. I think having a healthy competition, the insurers are necessary. They pick up an essential need in this country. I agree with Dan and certainly Devin in the comments around the pharmaceutical company. When you look at their profit margins, you look at their compensation, it is skewed. And I think we got to take a hard look at that. But I think having the healthy competition among the plans, whatever that may be. And also, maybe you let states decide that too. I mean, I think there's ways to look at that objectively to see what's best. But I don't think that moving to a single-payer system is going to just lump the cost back onto the American taxpayer. And then having, I'm not sure you'll have immediately any efficiencies whatsoever, and you're going to have it significantly increased costs. So I would be careful with that for sure.
Yeah, no, I think that's certainly true. It's it's kind of interesting that I think all three of you started mentioning the single payer or a single payer option, which I know is obviously part of the Democratic platform at this point. But that that seems it was, and I think one of you might have mentioned this. It seems like that was driven a lot by the Sanders campaign, which brings up another area that I wanted to dive into, which is what feels like kind of a populist role or a populist movement that popped up during this election cycle. Certainly Sanders seemed to be tapping it, and I'd argue that Trump is trying to tap that as well, because he clearly does not fit within the typical party mold. So is this kind of populist movement sustainable, and what real change could it have on on the healthcare system, since that is our particular focus today?
So I'll dive in. I agree that Bernie tapped into a real need and a deeper understanding of healthcare issues. One of the ways in which he missed, though, was by promoting single payer with an economic agenda that didn't support it. And one of the failings that I think was a missed opportunity on his part was helping the American people to understand what is, in effect, a nuanced distinction between single payer and universal health coverage. We haven't learned that yet, and we need to, because there's a big difference between those two, and yet they're often lumped together in pursuit of a political agenda. And I try very hard in the course of my book to help separate those two, because you can have universal health coverage in a multi-payer model. And there are great examples around the world where that works well in the health of a population. And that's what we really need to get to, is the health of a country, the health of a population, not just the health of a state or the health of a region, but in the health of a nation.
And maybe I'll build on the populist kind of side. And I think Dan, you did a great job talking about kind of Bernie and where that went. Maybe I'll talk about kind of where all that goes, and the energy now. And to me, I always remember somebody once told me in Congress that when a new party takes over, the first party says, gee, this is like a hot tub, right? And then the other party looks at it and goes, no, it's a swamp. It needs to be drained. And they get in, and then it becomes a hot tub. and I feel like a little bit that's how Congress tends to get in. And I think folks that might think, gee, this is terrible, and then all of a sudden they get into power. I tend to think that a lot of this populist stuff kind of goes back to the midline, right? And so, you don't see any giant swings necessarily. You do see some impacts. I mean, I think Bernie did a good job of getting some of his platform concerns, maybe not on healthcare, but in other areas into the Democratic base, which helps kind of move the ball along. But I'm not I might be a little bit more of a bear when I say that I think a lot of that energy that you felt around let's go do this. I think that's going to probably subside as you really kind of get into meeting the reality of legislating processes, regulating processes, and things will just kind of tend to a middle point.
Yeah, and I'm not going to disagree again with anything. I think that you look at, we're we the people is our constitution, and how our Constitution starts off, and I think that's kind of what America has felt over the last 3, 4, 5 years, that it's really not we the people. It really is. It's Washington. It's a lot of dictation coming at us. It's not that we feel like we're in control of anything, but yet we're all out there, working our 50, 60, 70, 80 hours a week, paying 30, 40, 50% in taxes, and we just don't feel like we have a lot of control. And I think that both sides want control back again, or at least want their voice heard. And everybody wants their voice heard. You look at how social media has blossomed and bloomed. That's about someone's voice being heard, at least someone feeling their voice is being heard because they're saying something or sharing something. So I think that's where it really came from. And I don't disagree that it will boil down to kind of legislative and regulatory components and how we'll move a lot of this forward, because that's the mechanics of our government. But I do see this continuing. I don't see some. Obviously, Clinton could certainly win, but Trump did come from the populist side. So if he won, he would kind of prove that populist theory. I don't think it's going anywhere. I don't think that the populist theory, in my at least in my estimation, or populist concept, is going to go away. I think this could actually be, over the next 4 years, depending upon what occurs, could actually be a larger driver for more of a quote-unquote revolt or more of a populist movement coming forth from either party. So.
So that's actually an interesting comment. I mean, when it comes to the populist, that kind of populist concept, do you think, and Justin, I think you said you don't necessarily, hopefully I'm saying this correctly, that you didn't necessarily see an impact on the regulatory side of things. Could it have an impact if, instead of trying to focus on the top line, if the populace then starts to focus on, okay, let's get people into office on a lower level and work our way up instead of trying to go from the top down?
I'll take that to start off with, and I say, yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly an option because that's actually how it's done. That's the strategy. I mean, I think we saw a lot of that even with Obama's initial campaign of kind of getting out there grassroots and beginning to layer on, your support throughout many structures inside the government, outside the government. And I think that's exactly how it's done. And you could see this movement over the next 10 years in politics shifting towards this direction. I'm not saying that could be interesting because it's turning our system on its head. But I think 9 out of 10 people, or not 9 out of 10, but maybe 5 out of 10, 6 out of 10 people that you ask might say that's a good thing. So.
Yeah, I mean, I'll build on Justin. I think anything's possible. I'll carry the bear still. This stuff will have to chip away. It'll play out in the background if it does. And again, I still think our country has a lot of other issues that are going to bump it. And, you got to get past Homeland Security first as an issue. And boy, are people wound up about that. Don't forget about Second Amendment gun rights now, right? That's all of a sudden a hot issue. So, I think all of these things are going to be, bubbling, and whether or not healthcare makes it through it as a populist movement over the front of the others, I guess time will tell.
So, Dan, do you want to add anything?
Not really, other than I'll close on the political side of that argument with the book that Lawrence Lessig wrote, which is Republic Lost. And the point that he makes through the book, which is really a compelling argument, and I think he's absolutely correct, is that campaign finance reform isn't the biggest problem facing the country, but it's the first, because we can't get to sort of these larger issues in the absence of dealing with campaign finance reform. It keeps coming up, in part because it keeps hitting the logjam in Congress relative to what needs to happen for real leadership. We don't allow real leadership to happen in the sense of the political landscape in D.C.
Totally agree.
So I think I'm going to turn the conversation a little bit back to the regulatory issues. Because I think I think there were comments about this, but I wanted to go down some of the other roads that came up first. But talking about talking about macro MIPS, as Justin was, it feels like there's still a whole host of regulations under the Affordable Care Act or some of the other more recent legislation that we're waiting for. I feel like, I can't remember where I saw it, but I have this memory of seeing a story saying that the regulators maybe weren't rushing to finalize things in the final days of the current administration because they felt that Clinton would win and things would kind of, I think we've been saying a little bit, would carry on as usual. So is that doing the system a disservice, or should we be should things continue to try and work on a normal calendar and get finalize these things so everyone can have some certainty as to what's going on? And
I'll take that if you want.
Oh, sure.
Oh, go ahead. I'll start off. So, I think, all right. So, I guess I spent a little time on the Hill, and I don't see that as the case. I do believe that we will get the MIPS and APM and the macro final rule here in November. I think that the administration is bullish to get it out there. I do believe you're going to get a little watered down. I think you're going to get some significant flexibility in 2017, but I think there's going to be options to start with MIPS or advanced APMs in 2017. So I just don't see it being pushed off. I guess there's support for it. There's obviously a lot of pushback that people had always give, but they give that every single rule. There's all these associations jump up and down. So But I think you're going to see traction this year with that rule, that final rule.
Yeah,
Devin?
maybe I'll pick up on number two on this. I think ultimately, I always go back to how the regulatory side, the administration works, right? And you have appointees and you have career civil servants, and a lot of the appointees will wash out of Washington, and a lot of the career civil servants will be there. And I think people that want to try to make their mark on DC and the administration as these appointees, they're going to want to try to get as much work done, and that's where I'm with Justin on this. I think some of these bigger pieces they're going to try to get through. Whether or not they can is a different story, but I think they're going to try. Particularly if they think it's going to be an enduring legacy. Obviously, Obama feels very strongly about healthcare as his legislation, his regulation. To the extent that I think that the administration can shepherd those through, I think you probably will see that this year. I don't think that people are necessarily throttling down for Clinton because it's unclear whether or not they're going to be around in the Clinton administration. They may or may not be. And so, if maybe the polls keep trending more towards Clinton, maybe some folks might somehow feel that way or get promises to stay in the campaign or stay in their current role. But I think by and large, most people are going to carry out their work that needs to get done.
Yeah, my view is just that MACRA and to a larger extent the ACA generally, these were legislative hurdles that were negotiated, and these were the best that we could get at the time. But are they reflective of necessary change at the core of healthcare, or are they simply reflective of changes that we've negotiated around the edges? And I think, again, MACRA, if you look at the history of MACRA, I mean, it really evolved out of SGR, and the failing of SGR to pass after 11 plus years of getting kicked down the road. So MACRA was born, in effect, at the death of SGR, and it was sprinkled with some meaningful use dust, and the hope is that this will have dramatic changes where I don't think it will. I don't think it can have the kind of dramatic changes that we need ultimately to address cost.
It really gets back to like that movie As Good as It Gets, and I think a lot of people are looking at MACRA like that, which is, it's what we got and what we got through, so let's just live with it.
Yeah, that's certainly the case. You can pine away all you want for what you might think of as the ideal, but you have to deal with the hand that you're dealt. So, especially from the government perspective, we keep talking about the challenges of trying to get new legislation or anything passed that, certainly you got, as you just said, Devin, if this is as good as it gets, then you got to work with that and try and improve it through, if you can, through the regulatory process. But talking about regulations, are there any outstanding ones that have either been proposed and not yet finalized, or are just missing that any of the three of you think we might see? For me, the one that pops to mind, because I do a lot of privacy and security work, is the accounting for disclosures rule under HIPAA, which is, I don't even know how many years late at this point. But do you guys have any guesses as to, or not guesses, but thoughts on what might be missing and what you hope would be coming out?
I don't necessarily have a lot in my book to say, gee, you can count on these. I think, to Justin's point earlier, obviously what they're working on right now, and the administration is really focused on trying to advance the current agenda on MACRA. There was a host of stuff that's been pushed back or pulled off, and I go back even on the data side of things. There were supposed to be certification of health plans, and all that got bumped. And I think some of these things where they don't have to do it, you may see the administration triaging these because there is a little bit of regulatory fatigue. If they come out with too much in the last quarter, you're just going to get a lot of hell raising. And I think they are going to have to pick and choose some of these. Accounting for disclosures, I don't know. I'm not a betting man on that one. I don't think you're going to see that in 2016.
So how about you, Dan?
Yeah, so I'll tell you one state that I'm looking at pretty carefully, because I think it is interesting that it's come yet again up at the state level, is Colorado, which is also going to vote this November on single payer for the state. And I think this is interesting only because it's the first time that it's come up on the ballot as an actual public voting initiative, as opposed to trying to legislate it as the governor did it, or tried to in Vermont, and as I think Massachusetts has successfully through the years adopted a variation. But this is first and foremost a ballot initiative in November. I don't think it'll pass, but I think it'll be interesting to watch how it gets defeated, and I don't expect it'll be the last time that we talk about it.
And Justin?
Yeah, no, very interesting about Colorado. I agree, that's something to watch closely. I think you've heard a lot about, I mean, from me on the regulatory side and the legislative side. I don't see anything significant emerging on the legislative side as well as the regulatory side other than MACRA. And your accounting disclosures, I've been following that, I guess, for 5 years now, maybe 6 years now. So that's been out there, yeah, accounting of disclosures has been out there for a very long time. So interesting, but I haven't seen any, muddling on that lately. But I mean, I'm also the guy that, I see it as it kind of comes, and I guess I just don't see any significant changes around where MACRA. So MACRA is, we're going to see it. We're going to see, everybody had a lot of say in it, and I guess there's a lot of support for getting MACRA through. I think Dan mentioned it 11 years in the making. I think I testified on the SGR reform at least 9 years in a row, specifically on the legislation to get SGR reform out there in some form or fashion. And then a lot of people had a lot of say in the creation of MACRA. And so I'm not going to, I can't, it's easy to sit back and throw tomatoes because everybody does that all the time with legislation, because when you're a leader in this country, someone's not going to like what you do. But that's what leadership is all about. You get up there and you do your very best. And I think that, the very best was created. There's a lot of people who had access to creating MACRA. And it'll never be perfect. Again, perfect is in the eye of the beholder. And I think that people say, all right, hey, this is going to be the future. We've got to figure it out. We've got to do our very best to engage it. We've got to learn it. We've got to get whatever it takes to navigate it successfully. What does it mean for my bottom line in putting those plans together? If you do that, I actually personally believe you'll be much more successful in the future than you are today. You'll make more money in the future than you can today if you successfully navigate MACRA and other legislation or regulation that's coming. So.
Yeah, no, I agree. It certainly feels like MACRA will be finalized. It's garnered so much attention, whether it be from the folks at CMS or the public. It's I think it seems like everyone's has that positive or that hopeful feeling that it will be out, and then we can kind of move from there.
We're going to make changes to MACRA. I'm sure it won't come out perfect. We always have additional changes that come to regulation. We've done all the way through other variations and iterations, and we'll all comment on it. So we'll change it too.
Yeah. So I noticed that we are starting to get towards the end of our time. So I'd like to kind of transition for the last few minutes into again trying to think about what could be coming. So I guess the first kind of summation question I'd like to throw out there is, what do each of you see will be the biggest change resulting out of the election? Whether, and I think this one, especially based on the way our conversation went, is, thinking about when I say the election, I'm thinking now top down, because it's, I think we're all in agreement that the presidential election is likely to not have as much of an impact maybe as the congressional or even the gubernatorial, depending on, on the state level. If you got some states that maybe haven't expanded Medicaid, having someone come in who would be open to some type of deal there. So, Dan, would you like to lead off with this one?
Sure. I'm going to go with a prediction that's probably a little bit different in the sense that we're going to look at new legislation that transcends any of the discussion that we've had so far. Matt, you alluded to it, which is cybersecurity. This is an issue where we haven't addressed it in healthcare, and it's kind of a gaping hole. And I've done a fair amount of research into this, and I'm going to be writing more about it as a topic under Forbes. In fact, I've got a piece queued up for tonight. Had one just last night or the night before. And I think cybersecurity is an issue that, I'll give you an example. Our family was a product, in full disclosure, our family was a part of the Anthem breach. So we got the notification of the Anthem breach. What's interesting to note about the Anthem breach is that it's not only the largest, it's one of the largest data breaches on record, but it's certainly the largest healthcare breach on record so far. And yet, as a company, Anthem didn't lose any revenue, they didn't lose any profits, their stock price continued to go up, and they lost no customers. So in effect, the signal that sends to the industry is one that will need to be addressed, and I think the only way you can do that is through legislation. And it may mean that we have to modify and change HIPAA in a way that becomes far more impactful than simply fining these companies through OCR in a way that they simply pass those costs on to all of us as consumers.
Yeah, I'll take a second stab on that issue. I think, regardless of who you see winning, I think cybersecurity is going to be an issue. And to go down that rabbit hole even further, I think it's also data segmentation issues around who owns your data, when can they use it, and how do they use it. It's a real big issue in healthcare. And it's even as we look forward around genomics, I think there can be some future work around genomics, but they're going to have to deal with some of these critical data access issues prior to really being able to move forward. And I think that's why you saw things like 21st Century Cures, that have gotten through the gate, because there's just a lot of other issues attached to it. So I think that's a biggie, right, is getting the cybersecurity piece. In terms of redoing HIPAA, it may be a component of that, or they'll chip away at HIPAA. Doing a brand new HIPAA will be an interesting exercise. I think there's a lot of people that say that it needs to be taken and thrown away and re-looked at from the patient's perspective, which I actually concur with, but it'll be a big lift around it. But I think they're going to have to deal with that. And I think the other piece around this is, going back to my first comment on exchanges, I think there is going to have to be some grand bargain on exchanges, at a minimum, to keep this thing afloat. That's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, I guess I'll round it out here, and it's a very big question. I think you can look at, you look at terrorism, national security, the economy. I don't think that we've seen true reports on jobs and what, how many people really are unemployed or just not employed at all and don't have access to employment. I think we're going to see some of that come out over the next couple of years. So at a national scale, and a national conversation, I think we're going to see more conversation around that. I think there's more of a threat there for our economy than we realize. Specifically on healthcare, I really do believe navigating the regulation as it comes out over the next year or so, next couple of years, is going to be front and center for care providers. It's the #1 issue. We'll continue to, cybersecurity I totally agree with, but that transcends everything. That's healthcare, that's national security too, that's economy. So there's a lot to that conversation, and I agree with the panelists so far on that too.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. Cybersecurity is a constant issue, and one that I don't think we've really seen seriously addressed yet by the legislature or any of the elected leaders. I think some of the agencies have been trying to get into it, but I definitely agree with all three of you that it's going to end up being a much larger issue and must be addressed, because we have to have some type of a solution there. This has been a great conversation, and believe it or not, we're actually out of time already. I'd like to thank each of you, Dan, Devin, and Justin, for a great conversation today.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you to everyone listening. Keep the dialogue going and connect with me at #HCDEJURE. I'm Matt Fisher. Until next time.